regular night in my apartment. I had finished taking a shower, feeling the warmth of the water still lingering on my skin. The day had been uneventful, and I was looking forward to a quiet evening. I grabbed my toothbrush and the toothpaste, ready to do the usual before heading to bed. As I looked at myself in the mirror, everything seemed perfectly normal, nothing out of the ordinary. It was the kind of peaceful moment that comes at the end of a long day, where the calmness of the night takes over. I brushed my teeth slowly, lost in thought, unaware of what was about to unfold. The only sound in the bathroom was the gentle hum of the fan and the rhythmic brushing of my teeth. I felt no sense of unease, no warning signs. Everything felt familiar, comforting even. But little did I know, something sinister was lurking just beyond the reflection in the mirror. It was in the midst of this quiet routine that it happened. As I stood there, caught in the monotony of the moment, something changed. There was a shift in the air, almost imperceptible, but enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I paused, my brush halfway to my mouth, suddenly aware that something was wrong. I couldn't explain why, but an eerie feeling began to settle in the pit of my stomach. And then as I looked back up at the mirror, it appeared, something I could never have anticipated, something that would haunt me forever. As I continued brushing my teeth, something in the mirror caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me after a long day. But then as I glanced up again, my heart stopped. There, behind me in the reflection, stood a woman. But this wasn't a normal woman. She was covered in bruises, dark purple marks all over her skin, as if she had been severely beaten. Her clothes were torn and filthy, clinging to her body in a way that only added to the unsettling image. The most horrifying part, though, was her face. Her eyes burned with an intensity of anger and suffering, a deep, primal emotion that I couldn't comprehend. She didn't belong here in my apartment in this moment. I froze. I couldn't breathe. My body felt completely paralyzed as my eyes were glued to the reflection. The toothbrush slipped from my hand, but I couldn't move to pick it up. The woman's presence, though silent, was so overwhelming that I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. It felt as if her gaze was searing through me, filling me with an unbearable sense of dread. I tried to scream, to call out for help, but my voice failed me. It was as if my body was locked in place, unable to do anything but stare at the apparition. Time seemed to stretch on, each second more agonizing than the last. My heart raced, my chest tightened, but I was completely powerless to react. The woman's mouth started moving, but the words she was trying to say didn't make any sense. Her lips twisted in fury, and I could see the desperate urgency in her expression. She was screaming something, but I couldn't make out a single word. I tried to understand, to make sense of what was happening, but everything felt muffled, distorted, like I was underwater. I tried to scream, to call out for someone, anyone, but no sound came. My throat was completely constricted, as if a hand was gripping it from the inside, preventing me from making even the smallest sound. I gasped for air, but it felt like my lungs had stopped working, like I was drowning in my own body. Every breath I tried to take only made me feel more suffocated, more helpless. The worst part was the feeling that something was coming, something far worse than just her presence. I could feel her getting closer, the air growing colder around me, a weight pressed down on me, a crushing pressure that seemed to pull at my chest and limbs, making it even harder to breathe. I couldn't escape. I couldn't do anything. My entire body was frozen, completely immobile, trapped in the mirror's reflection, forced to watch her. The closer she got, the more I could feel my mind spiraling into panic, but I couldn't fight it. The terror was too strong, the fear so deep that it felt like my very soul was being suffocated. And all I could do was watch as the woman, whatever she was, loomed over me, her anger and pain radiating like a physical force. After what felt like an eternity of suffocating panic, the woman vanished as suddenly as she had appeared. One moment she was there, her presence overwhelming, and the next, nothing. The air grew still, and the pressure on my chest lifted. I could finally breathe again, but each breath came with a shudder, a deep, unsettled tremor. I didn't think, I just acted. My body, still trembling, propelled me out of the room. My heart pounding in my ears, I ran. My legs feeling like lead, not knowing where I was going, only that I had to get away. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't understand. The figure, the sensation, the terrifying feeling, it all felt so real, so tangible. I stood outside the door, my hands shaking as I tried to steady myself. The fear, raw and paralyzing, clung to me like a second skin. I didn't want to go back in, didn't want to face whatever had just happened. But after a few moments, I forced myself to return, half expecting to see her still standing there, watching me with that hateful stare. But the room was empty, completely still, nothing. It was as if nothing had ever happened. But the fear didn't leave. It was etched into my bones, gnawing at me, making me feel like I was being followed, like something was still there, lurking just beyond my sight. The terror of it stayed with me, creeping up on me every time I closed my eyes, never allowing me to forget what had just occurred. When I finally fell asleep, I thought maybe, just maybe, I could escape the weight of what had happened. But when I woke up the next morning, the exhaustion hit me like a truck. It felt like I hadn't slept at all, like every muscle in my body had been drained. My head was heavy, and my thoughts were clouded, as though I had spent the entire night in a battle I couldn't remember. The physical and mental fatigue was suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. What had I really seen? Was it a nightmare, just a product of my overactive imagination? Or was it something far more sinister, something I couldn't comprehend? The more I thought about it, the more I questioned the reality of it all, unsure of what was real and what wasn't. But one thing I knew for sure, the fear still clung to me. That woman's face, her broken body, her rage. It was all burned into my mind. I couldn't escape it, no matter how hard I tried. I kept wondering if she would come back, if she would find a way to return and finish whatever she had started. The idea of her lurking just outside my door, waiting for me to let my guard down, kept me on edge. I didn't feel safe. The normalcy of my life, everything I had known, felt like a distant memory. That night, that presence, had changed everything. I was no longer sure of my own reality or what might be lurking in the shadows, waiting to pull me back into the nightmare. It was just another ordinary night at home. I was sitting alone in the living room, watching TV with all the lights off, letting the glow of the screen be the only source of light in the room. The stillness of the night was almost peaceful, but my insomnia kept me restless. It was already past 1:30 in the morning, and I was starting to feel a gnawing hunger in my stomach. I decided to go to the kitchen to grab something to eat. I opened the fridge and found a piece of chocolate cake left over from earlier. It seemed like the perfect snack to quiet the emptiness I felt inside. After grabbing a plate and sitting down at the kitchen table, I began to eat. The silence was almost too much, like the house itself was holding its breath. But then, as I chewed, I started to notice something odd. There was a strange feeling in the air, like the atmosphere had shifted somehow. I couldn't quite place it, but a growing unease crept over me. It was as if I wasn't truly alone anymore, despite the stillness of the house. Just as I took another bite, I heard something faint but distinct. The sound came from the kitchen door. I stopped mid-chew and turned my head. I couldn't see anything, but I clearly heard the doorknob start to twist back and forth like someone on the other side was trying to get in. The door was made of glass, so I could only make out vague shadows through the darkness outside. But there was no one there. My heart skipped a beat and my mind raced. Something was definitely wrong. As I continued eating the cake, trying to shake off the weird feeling in the air, a noise broke the silence. It was subtle at first, but then it grew louder. A harsh, erratic rattling coming from the kitchen door. I froze mid-bite, my heart racing as I looked toward the source of the noise. The doorknob was turning violently, twisting back and forth as though someone was desperately trying to get in. I couldn't see anything on the other side of the door, not a shadow or a silhouette. The darkness outside was thick, so thick that I couldn't make out any details, but I could hear it. Whoever or whatever was on the other side of that door, trying to force their way in. The rattling continued, sending chills down my spine. My breath caught in my throat, and a cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. The fear that I'd been trying to suppress suddenly consumed me. I didn't know what to do. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body was react. Panic took over, and I instinctively scrambled under the kitchen table, hiding in the shadows. My pulse thundered in my ears as I held my breath, praying that whatever it was wouldn't find me. The doorknob twisted again, this time with more force, and I felt my body tense, every muscle on high alert. I could hear nothing now except for the maddening sound of that twisting handle. My hands shook violently as I crouched under the table, terrified of what would happen next. In the midst of the overwhelming panic, I couldn't hold it in anymore. My voice trembled as I screamed, "Dad!" The word barely escaped my lips, but somehow it was loud enough to be heard. I heard his footsteps immediately, the sound of him rushing down the stairs in a hurry. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last, as the rattling of the doorknob continued relentlessly, filling the silence with its eerie rhythm. I could barely breathe as I huddled under the table, my body frozen in terror. The door felt like it was getting closer, the rattle now almost a deafening sound. I tried to stay silent, to stay hidden, but every part of me was screaming, begging for help. My father's footsteps grew louder, his presence like a faint beacon of hope. But the fear was too much, too overpowering. As my father reached the kitchen, I could hear him grab the baseball bat we kept by the door for protection. I could hear the determination in his movements, the way he prepared himself for whatever was behind that door. I could imagine his face, filled with concern and fear, but also a fierce resolve to protect me. I knew he was ready to face whatever was out there, but my body was still paralyzed, unable to move or help him in any way. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice stern and commanding as he moved toward the door. The doorknob stopped turning. The silence that followed felt suffocating, and for a moment, I wondered if whatever was out there had heard my father's command. Would it run away? Or was it just waiting for us to make the next move? My father reached the door and shouted, demanding to know who was on the other side. The moment his voice cut through the silence, the rattling of the doorknob abruptly stopped. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment there was nothing but the sound of our breathing in the tense quiet. Then, in one swift motion, my father yanked the door open and flicked on the outside light, his eyes scanning the area, searching for anything that could explain what had just happened. To his shock, there was nothing. No one. The yard was empty, bathed in the harsh glow of the porch light, revealing nothing but shadows. My father stepped outside, looking around frantically, his eyes darting from one corner to the other. But no matter how hard he searched, there was no sign of anyone, not a soul in sight. Considering how violently the doorknob had been turning, there was no way anyone could have run off that quickly without being seen. The eerie silence that followed was almost suffocating. My father stood there for a few seconds, still gripping the baseball bat, trying to make sense of it all. I stayed hidden under the table, my mind racing, struggling to piece together what had just occurred. There was no logical explanation. Whoever or whatever had been at that door was now gone, leaving only a lingering sense of dread in its wake. The air in the kitchen felt thick with uncertainty, and a chilling realization settled in. Whatever had been there, whatever had caused that doorknob to turn like a madman's game, was not something that could be easily explained. The fear of the unknown crept back into my bones, more intense than ever. Something was out there, and it had somehow vanished without a trace. Shaking with fear, I tried to make sense of everything that had just happened. My father and I checked the area around the house, looking for any sign of what or who might have been there. We inspected the yard, the surrounding bushes, and even the street, but there was nothing. No footprints. No trace of any person, animal, or anything that could explain what had caused that doorknob to spin uncontrollably. It was as if the whole thing had been a nightmare, something that couldn't possibly have happened in the real world. But despite the lack of evidence, the feeling of unease lingered. It was as if the air itself was still heavy with the presence of something unnatural, something that had been there, only to disappear without a trace. I couldn't shake the thought that whatever had caused that doorknob to turn like it did wasn't just a random occurrence. There was something more sinister at play, something beyond our understanding. And that thought filled me with dread. The event left a permanent mark on my mind, a dark shadow that I couldn't escape. The image of that rattling doorknob and the terror that washed over me stayed with me for days. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Even though my father had tried to brush it off as some kind of prank or misunderstanding, I knew deep down that what we had experienced was not something that could be easily explained away. The mystery of the turning doorknob and the sudden, unexplained presence outside our kitchen door would never be solved. It haunted us, a reminder of how fragile our sense of security really is, and every time the house grew quiet at night, I couldn't help but wonder, what was it that came to our door that night, and what did it want?